excited that the weather's cooled off and we can start doing this. I do love gardening myself though, and all of us here are organic, so when we give you any kind of advice, it's always going to be the organic way. We try not to sell any chemicals. There's one or two things that we offer that aren't organic, but 99% of everything we do here is organic, and we don't treat any of our plants. Once they get here, we don't know what the growers do, but once they get here, they're not treated with anything chemical. Why don't y'all tell me what it is you want to grow? Start there. What are you planning on trying to grow?
Mostly fall vegetables and lettuce, that type of thing. I have a veggie pod, and that's what it's a 3x3 square, and that's what I do all my veggies in.
How about you?
I have a pretty good sized garden that's got a 2.5 foot fence to keep the bunnies out. I'm thinking of maybe carrots this fall. I haven't had real good luck with Brussels sprouts and broccoli. I mean, the plants look okay, but then you don't get that much for vegetables. So just wanted to get your suggestion on beets. So I'm just interested in trying some new things.
Okay. And you, ma'am? What kind of things were you looking to grow this year?
I just do all kinds of different things. I've been doing things in flower pots because I don't have a sunspot right at the moment for a actual big bed. But I've grown everything: sweet potatoes, new potatoes. I want to grow more radishes.
That's a good one.
That's a very good one.
Yeah.
And maybe some of the lettuces. I haven't done that.
Maybe you could share with us what you have in mind for your vegetable garden.
I have no idea. We have never done a fall garden, so I'm basically here to learn.
Okay. Well, I love the greens and the broccolis and the cauliflowers and all that kind of stuff. Those are really my favorite kind of vegetables anyway. And so this is really the best time of year, I think, to start those kinds of vegetables because, for one thing, they need the cooler weather, but also because we have, usually anyway, a mild winter where things don't generally freeze. We might get down to freezing, but if it's just like overnight or whatever, that's not the same as like what they have up north where the ground freezes, for 3 months out of the year. So you can actually, most years, you can actually grow your green vegetables like your lettuces and stuff like that all the way from like September into the following spring. If you succession plant and if you do things like just leave the plant in the ground and harvest the leaves off of them rather than yanking the whole plant out, you can extend your growing season sometimes all the way until like March or April. At least I've been able to do that. And some of your plants are biennial, so like your Swiss chard, for example, is a biennial. Parsley is a biennial, which means that it's an annual is one that grows for 1 year and basically and then dies. A biennial grows for 2 years and then dies. So like parsley doesn't flower the first year, it flowers the second year because then that's when it's trying to propagate itself before it dies. And Swiss chard, I had it grow for more than 2 years.
Yeah, I can. It can go for several years.
I had some that I had planted as a border 1 year in my front yard, and I left them in there for, I don't know, I finally dug them out because I wanted to plant something else there, and these things were like tree trunks.
Yep.
And they just kept putting on leaves, and more leaves and more leaves, and so you can garden almost all year round. All of your vegetables are going to need pretty much full sun. There are some herbs and stuff that will take some shade, but full sun. So when you're locating your garden, you want to find a place that's going to get 6 hours of sun, ideally. If you get 5, you can get away with 5. probably, you know, but 6 hours is what we consider to be full sun here. Anyway, so if you're doing a raised bed, it's a lot easier because you don't have to worry about tree roots digging around, you know, roots of your other plants and stuff. But on the other hand, I like to mix in my vegetables with the rest of my beds if I can, just so that I can, for one thing, maximize the amount that I'm able to grow. And then a lot of your plants, actually, a lot of your vegetable plants are ornamental. I mean, they sell ornamental cabbage, so why not buy edible cabbage and use that instead? You know, that's my philosophy. And then the bright light Swiss chard, that's what I was talking about when I said I had grown them as a border in my beds. The bright lights are really colorful and pretty. So, you know, one of my neighbors down the street from me, he's got his whole front bed is just vegetables. And he's got trellises in there for the beans and stuff like that. And it doesn't look bad is the thing. It doesn't look bad. That's, if you belong to an HOA, they might not let you do it just because they don't like the way it looks. But there's no reason why you can't do that. So you also want to make sure that wherever you're doing your garden that you have good drainage. You don't ever want anything to puddle or, you know, stay muddy or anything like that. And then if you need to create shade, which this time of year you don't normally need to worry about creating shade because the weather's cooler to begin with. But in the summertime, even your peppers and tomatoes like some afternoon shade. So if you can rig up something to, you know, to shade them a little bit in the late afternoon, that can be beneficial. And one way that you can do that is to plant taller plants on the sunny side to create, you know, kind of like a shady tree effect on the plants on the other side of it. So if you need to create shade, that's something to think about as you're planning your garden, where you're going to place things so that the taller plants are going to be shading the lower growing plants. And then plan ahead, as I have in my little handout here. Planning ahead is good because it helps you figure out how many plants you're going to need, how many seeds you're going to need if you're doing seeds, and not waste your money on buying too many plants or buying the wrong plants and then not having a place to put them and that sort of thing. And then everything starts with your soil. So that's the most important thing, really. And for soil, if you have a raised bed, just get the raised bed mix. Don't try to make your own. I've had customers that have just made themselves crazy trying to figure out how to blend all of the ingredients that are in that bag to get the right ratios, and then you end up with too much vermiculite and not enough of something else, and what do you do with the extra? Just buy the raised bed mix. Save yourself a lot of time and money in the long run. The raised bed mix is great because it's ready to plant. It's unlike your compost, which you have to mix compost in with the soil in the ground, the existing soil, because otherwise there can be too much microbial activity, and that excess activity can burn the roots of your plants. So whenever you're using just regular compost, you always want to mix that in with something else that's cooler, like the existing soil. And I'd say 50-50 is what I use as my rule of thumb. So 50% new material, 50% existing material. But with the raised bed mix, you don't need to do that. It's nice and black and crumbly. If you want, if you want to come up and feel it and look at it, you can do that. But it's just nice. It's ready to plant. It's got a few big chunks in it, but that's okay because those are just going to break down over time and keep adding, more beneficial stuff to the soil. It gives all of the little decomposing creatures in the soil something to do. feeds them and helps keep the soil healthy. So don't worry if you see little chunks like this. No, this is no big deal. So start with good soil, and if you're doing it in the ground with compost, it's like no more than 3 inches, especially with your like greens and stuff like that. These kind of vegetables, they have pretty shallow roots, so you don't need to compost 6 feet down. I mean, you just need the layer, the top layer for the to freshen that up, so that the roots are getting some fresh nutrients. And then, people always ask me, well, what kind of compost should I use? What's the best compost? And there is some quality variation in the different types, but if you're choosing between, say, cottonwood and mushroom compost, my feeling is that in an organic world, you want to have as much biodiversity as possible, and so changing up what kind of compost you use from one season to the next, I think could be beneficial, rather than just always using mushroom or always using cottonwood. So those are all good composts. There's no reason to not use any of them, but just from a diversity standpoint, you might want to just mix it up. If you're a beginner, I always recommend just keeping it simple, unless you've already got experience. I was telling Matt this morning, I did another talk a couple of weeks ago, and I was telling people not to start tomatoes from seed because it was too hard, and she was shaking her head at me, and I do it all the time, and it's great, I don't have any problem. And I'm like, well, keep doing what you're doing. If it's working, why not? But for a beginner, there's some plants that are really easy to start from seed, and some that are trickier, and tomatoes are one of the trickier ones. So I always recommend that you, with the bigger plants like that, you start from a starter plant like one of these. Lettuces and things like that are a lot easier to start from seed. Those I wouldn't have any trouble doing if you want to, even if you're a beginner. That's not too hard to do if you want to try doing it from seed. But the easiest thing is to just buy the plant that's already started. You don't have to, if you do seed, then you have to go back and thin stuff out. And if you just plant plants, then you don't have to do that either. So that saves you some time there. What do we mean when we say good soil? Well, like I said, this is ready to plant. And you don't have to add anything to it if it's your first season. If you've already had it in your raised bed and you've already grown stuff in it, then that's considered to be existing soil, so you would want to amend it. At least with a fresh layer of compost. What I do, even when I'm planting in the raised bed mix, I always start off my plants with our little planting recipe, which is this handout here. And this calls for expanded shale, which is what's in this bag here, and I can pass this around if you want to see what it looks like. But it's basically small pebbles that have been fired in a kiln. So it's shale left over from fracking or whatever it is that they do, and you get a gravel sized pieces that they put in a kiln, and when they fire it in the kiln, it kind of pops. Like, I think of it as popping popcorn, and when it pops, it creates holes in the material, and those holes can hang on to water. It can hold like 3 times its weight in water. So for Texas, especially in summertime, if you're doing your summer vegetables, it could be really beneficial to have some expanded shale, or lava sand is an alternative if you don't want to do the shale. Lava sand is similar. It's also a porous type rock, and those pores hold on to the moisture, so that helps. But the expanded shale is best at retaining moisture, I think, of the two options. So when I plant, I use this little recipe, and I start by making my planting hole, and I'm just going to go ahead and do it here. Excuse me. And let's see, this is my pak choy. I love pak choy. It's one of my favorite ones, and you can't get it in the store here. I'm from California, and it was everywhere. You know, you could break big bunches of it. Here, they don't even know what it is. So when you make your hole, you want to make it a little bit bigger than the pot that it comes in. So I'm just gonna, spread the dirt out here. This is already nice and moist too. And then hang on to this, because you're gonna forget what you planted. I do. So keep that handy. And then you want to just turn the pot upside down, and then I'll pinch it right here, and it just slides right out. And you still have the whole root ball intact. And then this is already nice and loose, so you don't have to pull the roots apart like you might with one that's been in the pot a lot longer. But this is ready to just stick in the hole. But before I do that, I'm going to put in some of my expanded shale, just like a handful for each one of these. It's going to help with the root. Put in your soft rock phosphate. We don't have an open bag of
Oh, we don't. No, yeah.
earthworm castings. So I'm going to skip the earthworm castings because I don't want to open a bag just to pull out one handful. But imagine that I put a handful of earthworm castings in here. And then now I'm ready to put in my liquid seaweed, and actually I'm going to do that before I put the plant in. So another thing I should mention when you're planting is that you never want to put a plant in a dry hole. So when you're transplanting like this, you want to make sure that this part is wet, and if it's not, you can just dump it in your liquid seaweed mixture to wet it, and then you want to use 1 ounce of seaweed per gallon of water. And I'm just going to pour some in. I'm not going to measure it out, but it's basically the roots of the process are wet. And now I'm ready to stick my plant in there, and then I'm going to backfill with the dirt. And make sure when you plant too, you want to tamp it down, but you don't ever want to plant too high. So, like with this one here, you've got little leaves right up against the ground level. You don't want to cover those up with new dirt. You want to keep the dirt at about the same level that it's now in the pot. And then tamp everything down so that it's nice and firmly planted in there, and then come back and add some more water, some liquid seaweed water on top of that. And then go on to your next plant. So with a plant like this, I put it in the middle, but if I put it around the sides, I could probably fit 3 or 4 plants in here in a pot this size. Assuming that we're doing green things like that. So that's really the planting process for green vegetables like lettuces and stuff like that. Those you want mainly to grow top growth. You want the foliage to grow. You don't want it to flower. You want it to grow more leaves. And so that's where the nitrogen comes in. Nitrogen is what helps the plant to produce the foliage part of the plant. The phosphate and the root of the potassium, those are going to help with producing buds and blooms. And so, with tomatoes, you want buds and blooms because you want that fruit. with your lettuce, you want the green leaves. So you want to use more nitrogen and less of the other stuff. And the highest nitrogen product that we have out here would be the blood meal, which is a 1200. That's the highest you're going to see in an organic program. Blood meal is pretty much the highest nitrogen product there is. So you can fertilize with the blood meal. You can also use like the garden tone. I should grab an espoma product. We carry the most of the espoma fertilizers. They're all organic, and this one here is formulated for it's a general formula for vegetables. It's actually a 3-4-4. So the first number is nitrogen. So it's actually a little heavy on the buds and blooms for green leafy vegetables, but they're again, alternatively the blood meal. Some of their other fertilizers, they all have different number ratios. So you just want to be looking for one that's where the first number is the high number. And that's going to be the best thing for green leafy vegetables. And then another thing you can add if you want especially if you've got kind of a existing soil that's maybe tired, has already been heavily used. Another thing you might want to add would be the Texas green sand. Texas green sand is like a vitamin shot for your plants. It's got lots of minerals in it. It's got iron, calcium, magnesium, I'm not sure how many other things, but it's gonna, the consistency of it will help to break up clay soil. So if you have heavy clay soil, it's a good amendment for that. But it's also got those minerals in it to replace the ones that get consumed by the plants as they're growing. And you can put that in, mix it in with the soil, or you can spread a little bit on top. It works either way. But that would be something that you could think about adding. You wouldn't need to do it in the raised bed mix because it's actually already got some green sand in there. But later on, if you're reusing the soil later on, then you can add some more. And bone meal if you need calcium for any reason. It's not, again, tomatoes are not a fall vegetable, but if you're doing tomatoes, calcium helps prevent blossom end rot, which is a disease that tomatoes get. Well, it's not a disease, it's a vitamin deficiency. And the missing vitamin is calcium. And what happens to the tomato is that the end where the flower is, literally rot. Basically, any of your cool weather vegetables for Texas are going to be the green leafy things, the root vegetables, and what they call cruciferous vegetables: broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage. The cowpeas are another thing that you can grow in the fall, and that's always been pretty popular here in Texas. I guess it's kind of a southern thing. But if you like black-eyed peas and that type of stuff, this is when you want to grow those. You can grow beans too, I guess, up until first crop.
Yep.
You mention on your planting calendar here, which is actually two-sided. On one side you have some suggestions for those of you who may not already be organic and you want to convert to being an organic gardener. This gives you a recommendation for how to approach that. And then on the other side we have our vegetable planting calendar, and the dates on here are specific for North Texas. Now that said, North Texas is a pretty big area, and so somebody who lives in Dallas, like East Dallas, they get a little bit more rain than we do. A little bit further north, it's going to be colder, but it's still going to be part of North Texas. So these are guidelines. If you look in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The eighth column over has the fall planting dates. There's one column is for spring planting dates, the other column is for fall planting dates. And so, it'll tell you, it gives you a window of a few weeks of, when you can start your seeds. And, it's always a good idea to succession plant your seeds. And it's, for one thing, it helps stretch out your harvest, so you're not harvesting everything at the same time. But it also, if something goes wrong, you still have some more seeds you can put out, and try again. So there are a couple of reasons for succession planting. But these dates are pretty reliable, even with all of the supposed climate change that we've had and stuff like that. These dates are pretty good to go by. They'll vary a little bit from year to year, depending on when fall arrives exactly and stuff. Baking stuff. Most of your fall vegetables don't need staking because your greens are going to be lower growing type plants anyway. They're not going to be vining plants. But any kind of vining plants, if you're doing something like that, beans, for example, you would want to have some kind of trellis or what they call a teepee. You can take like bamboo, pieces of bamboo and form them into a teepee type shape, and then use that as a trellis in your raised bed. We sell some smaller trellises if you want to do that route. Tomato cages are another way to trellis. So if you're going to be doing anything like that, be ready, put the stakes in at planting time. Don't wait until the plant is already, going all over the place and then try to pull it back through the trellis. You want to keep it, keep forming it onto the trellis as it's growing, because you don't want to damage it when you're pulling on it, and after it's already gone off in one direction and you're trying to pull it back, you can damage it. So don't try to do that. And then vegetables are heavy feeders, so they need to be fertilized pretty regularly. I do mine every couple weeks with the vegetable fertilizer, one of the vegetable fertilizers, like the Garden Tone. If you want, you can do just a soil feeding, where you put liquid or granules on the soil and water that in. If you want to, you can also do foliar feeding. It just gives your plant 2 ways to take up the nutrients it needs. Foliar feeding is pretty easy. You can just mix it up in a spray bottle. If you have a small garden, you can just use a squirt bottle. Yes, ma'am.
So how often should we add some seaweed to our water? When we water every time, just at planting?
I just do it at planting time.
Okay.
Because once the roots are established, you want the top growth. You want to focus on the top growth.
Right.
So the first couple weeks is when you want that root stimulator to be working.
That's the main point.
But yeah, generally, I fertilize every couple weeks with a more balanced fertilizer than, like I said, the seaweed is pretty much just a root stimulator. It's not going to do much for your top growth. So you don't want to just use that. Yes, sir.
What about coffee and eggshells?
Coffee is great for acidifying your soil and adding organic matter. So are eggshells. Eggshells are another way to get calcium into your soil. So again, if you have a calcium deficiency like the blossom end rot, you can put some eggshells around your plants. I would crush them up as much as I could before I did that. But I use when I make my coffee, I use those little pods in the store here, and I use the reusable one where I put my own coffee grounds in it, and when I'm done, I dump them out in the plants. When you're watering, you always want to try to water the soil and not the foliage of the plant. So when you're foliar feeding, obviously you're going to be getting moisture on the plant. And when you foliar feed, it's best if you can do that in the early morning, because plants are more receptive at that time of day to absorbing the dew and whatever moisture is available to them at that time of day. That's when there's going to be dew on the plants and stuff, and so they'll absorb that moisture. So that's a great time to do your foliar feed. When you don't want to put it on is in the middle of the afternoon in the hot sun, when the sun is shining down on the plants, because that can cause those droplets of moisture can get amplified by the sunlight and burn holes in the leaves of your plants. And especially for vegetables, you don't want that. It doesn't look good, but it doesn't hurt anything, but it doesn't look good, and so you don't want to do that. So you want to try to get the moisture on the soil. And with some of your low-growing plants, that can be challenging, especially if you have them close together. But if you use a watering can rather than a sprinkler, or spraying a hose over top of everything, it's just best if you can try to keep it off the foliage. Early morning is the best time to water, because you have time for the moisture to sink down into the soil before the sun comes up and starts evaporating things off. And then most of your vegetables want to be kept evenly moist. So rather than letting them dry all the way out, you want to try to water regularly, but you also don't want the soil to get too wet. So I always just stick my finger down in the soil and see how it feels. This is already pretty moist, so I'm not going to need to water this again for a while. If you stick it all the way down to here and it's still dry at your fingertip end, then you definitely need to water. Diseases, pests and diseases, cutworms. I've always had trouble with those guys. And let's see. We can use I didn't bring out the BT, but there's a couple of options for those. There's a product called Bacillus thuringiensis, which we just call BT. It's a lot easier to say. But it's a naturally occurring bacteria that only affects the larval stage of insects. So any insect that goes through a larval stage would be infected with this disease when you're applying it on your plants, and that would keep the caterpillar from maturing. There's also a product called spinosad or spinosad. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but
Yeah, I say spinosad,
but
I don't know how to say it either, really.
and that's more of a general purpose insecticide. But the nice thing about the BT is that it's very specific to caterpillars. And I like to, especially being an organic gardener, I like to try to limit my pesticide use even in an organic environment, because I still don't want to, like with, for example, triple action, if you're using that and you get it on the flowering part of the plant, that can affect bees when they come to pollinate on that flower. So I just try to avoid using it unless I really need to. I try not to use any kind of pesticide at all. I try to rely on my beneficial insects, like for ladybugs and stuff like that. But if it does get out of control and you feel like you need to do it, the triple action is going to be the broadest spectrum organic product that we sell. So it's going to kill pretty much any insect on your plant, including the bees and the butterflies. So just keep that in mind. Neem oil is great, and that's a 3-in-1 product, because it's a insecticide, a miticide, and a fungicide. So if you have powdered mildew or something like that, neem oil is a really good product to use. If you have, it'll also do aphids and then spider mites, which are usually a hot weather thing. So you usually don't have spider mites in the fall. It's another nice thing about fall gardening is a lot of your insects just aren't around. It's mostly, I don't know, for me it's mostly darn old cut ones and cabbage worms. that
Yeah.
drive me
Yeah, a
crazy.
lot, mainly cabbage worms, what you're gonna get. If you're doing tomatoes, you'll still run into hornworms
Yeah.
coming up till we get colder. Yeah, that's mainly what it is for me. That's what, You
Yeah.
always have things like mealybugs, aphids, those can still happen as well too.
Yeah.
But not nearly as bad. The pest problems won't be nearly as bad in the fall as they are in the spring. Or they shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's another nice thing about fall gardening is you just have fewer pests. You know, even mosquitoes, they're just not around as much.
Yeah.
You know, so they're less. In cool weather, you are a little bit more prone to fungus, especially if it's moist. That's another reason to not water your foliage if you don't have to, because that moisture encourages fungal growth. So you want to try to keep that foliage dry. But if you do get a fungus, the neem oil is really the best thing for that. Let's see. And then, you know, we all have failures. So, you know, my best advice I think is just don't let failure keep you from trying again, from continuing to garden and try other things. You know, try to learn what you can from your failure and just apply that to the next season, and keep on growing stuff. You know, because I mean, I've had good years and bad years where I've had years where I've had gobs and gobs of tomatoes that I couldn't give away all the I had so many, and then other years I've just not been able to get but one or two tomatoes, and that's just life in Texas. But I think, generally speaking, I think it's just a lot easier to grow your fall vegetables. It's just, you're more likely to be successful because the plants are just easier to grow and they have fewer problems. You don't have vitamin deficiencies and things like that with, as long as you're fertilizing regularly, you're not going to have vitamin deficiencies, you're not going to have as many pest problems, you're not going to have a drought problem, stuff like that. So I'm all about fall vegetable gardening.